Welcome to the Healthcare Disaster Preparedness Through Lessons Learned conference call. My name is James, and I'll be your operator for today's call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. During the Q&A session, if you have a question, please press *1 on your phone. And also note this conference is being recorded. I'd like to turn the call over now to Mark Marabello. Mark, you may begin.
Hello, James. Thank you very much. Aloha, everyone, and welcome today. We are very grateful during this time of year and Thanksgiving. We're particularly grateful to have Dr. Christopher Crabtree as part of our healthcare emergency management team here. He is the director, recently promoted to executive director. I've spent the last few weeks working in the territory on deployment there to help out after the typhoon that hit. He began his career as a firefighter and paramedic in Maryland, where he then served as a paramedic and flight paramedic after that for the city and county of Honolulu and the Hawaii Air Ambulance from 2004 to 2007. Mr. Crabtree, Dr. Crabtree holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Asian Studies, a Master of Public Administration, and a Doctor of Public Health degree from the University of Hawaii in Manoa. He is also a board-certified emergency manager. So, Dr. Crabtree, take it away.
Great. Thank you. Aloha, everybody. Okay, let's get started. So I wanted to take you through this process of looking at preparedness in healthcare, but through the lens of lessons learned from various events, from everywhere from last year, just since it's so fresh, and there was a lot of good lessons from that hurricane season, as well as this year, which has been extremely busy. I know the hazards and risks vary from location to location. It's been a busy year in a sense for us with respect to flood events, weather events, hurricanes, believe it or not, lava events, as well as plane crash and many others. So based off of all of that and those that have happened worldwide as well as nationwide, let's take a look at some of those lessons. So one of the things that was learned was there was a lack of timely, accurate, and vetted information that was coming in to afford healthcare facilities enough information rather to make informed decisions and important decisions in order to act appropriately. And most of the time, we do what we can with what we have, and we respond. And so it's a matter of looking at what are the communication pathways. One of the things that we try to do, at least in Hawaii, is that through the coalition, we try to be that single point of vetted information that alerts and notifies our healthcare facilities, including long-term care, home health hospice, hospitals, assisted living facilities, ambulatory surgical centers, and the list goes on, the whole continuum, dialysis centers, etc., of what's going on and providing them that key information that healthcare facilities are needed, or rather are needing in order to make those decisions. Another lesson learned was the fact that there were a lot of phone trees that were not updated. And, obviously, there's a variety of different platforms that are used, everything from texting platforms to software platforms to the old but true phone tree that is utilized for in disasters. And that's one thing, as well as any type of a software platform where you have people's contact information, keeping that up to date when nothing is happening. Which fortunately occurs a lot, but it comes in spurts. And so, looking at is how do we ensure that our phone tree and our contact information for all the leadership as well as those key individuals that we're going to need to contact in order to push that information forwardly down is on that call. Also the lack of confirmation and response. This had to do with a lot of facilities that were using texting and other platforms to push out information, but they were trying to get accountability on their personnel as well as to get them to come in for different shift changes, what have you, and we're having challenges with their staff providing or at least responding to them. And it wasn't a matter of the staff not wanting to, it was a variety of some other information. So it was coming up with how do you come up with a system in which you can communicate with your staff, with your key leadership in a timely manner, and get fairly timely responses from them to ensure that they actually have obtained that information. And that's tough. You can see on the bottom right-hand corner is one thing that we experienced on January 13th, and this isn't a common risk, but was a false ballistic missile threat in Hawaii. I'm sure everybody heard that. And the challenge is that on certain alert systems, some people got the alert, some people did not get the alert. And so the challenge is I'm hearing information, but I'm not sure whether or not it's accurate, whether it's vetted information, and some people are just not getting it. So how do we come up with multiple redundancies in which if somebody doesn't get that information, how can we retap them? And some of that is software, but software is not always the best solution. Sometimes it's just a matter of if we don't get a confirmation, having some type of a policy is if we don't have a confirmation within a certain time frame, even though a lot of things are going on, is we need to have follow-up in order to ensure that everyone's getting the single message and is able to respond and act accordingly. And that's where we get a lot of our contingent communication devices. And these are not only just to send out information, but more so is to be able to communicate with each other in the event of a disaster or a major emergency in which phone lines are down, cell service or internet is down. And what we found is, and this I'm sure is a common thread, is there's a lack of depth in communication and contingency communication. It's hard we tend to go from phone to cell phone. As cell phone goes down, sometimes we have other types of devices. We here in Hawaii use a combination of different ones, and I'll go over that as potentials. We use analog phones for some of our facilities because sometimes it's tried and true when we lose power or what have you, that's still working. But in absence of that, there's a variety of different other considerations that we have to have, and that's satellite phones. But there are limitations to that. And those limitations are with, for example, and I don't work for any disclosure, any of these satellite companies and such, but like, for example, Iridium, a lot of people, and I believe it was last year, were trying to use a sat phone, but those satellites can get overwhelmed. There's a variety of other ones. There's ham radio that we can use. Ham radio is good, but it's open net, so patient information and such can't be passed. Or if it is, you're exposing yourself to a lot of liability. But it is a good alternative if you needed to request stuff and just to get information through in absence of satellite, in absence of analog, in absence of some people have 800 megahertz or they have other types of radio devices that they use. But if that's all down, ham radio is a viable option. Now, there's also something called digital ham radio, which allows you to transmit documents via ham radio. But there's limitations to that if it gets clogged, if a lot of people are on that. But, again, that's why it's important to have multiple redundancies in our communication platforms. If we have analog, we can have analog as a backup, but if that fails, what is a backup for that backup, and so forth. There's also something called share resource, which I wanted to mention to you. Is something that in Hawaii we tested at our annual full-scale exercise last year, and that is a system that's already in place. It's a high-frequency band that was run by Homeland Security, but they're actually allowing critical infrastructure within communities, or rather within states, to utilize that. And we've got license for that in Hawaii. Hawaii, and we're slowly trying to figure it out and develop our concept and to slowly try to implement it. And what that does is that's a secured high-frequency band that allows us to transmit data, not voice, but data in the event of a disaster when everything else is down. And that came out of Puerto Rico when their communication infrastructure took obviously a significant hit. And ham radio was working, but they had this thing called share resource, and this high-frequency band that was just not being utilized, just because I don't think anyone knew about it. They also didn't know what its capability was, and so as a consequence of that, Homeland Security had approached us in Hawaii and asked healthcare if this was something that we're interested in. So it's just food for thought. I would try to reach out if you haven't, if you're outside of Hawaii from whatever other state you might be from, and or to your coalition and see if they've looked into something like that, because what we're going to be utilizing that for is in the event that all communication down to push any messages, whether it's requests for assistance, whether or not it's whether we need to evacuate manifests, as well as accountabilities, and just our way to communicate back and forth when everything else is down. And then there's wireless priority cell. And that's great to have when wireless is up, but when wireless is down or spotty, SMS text usually is the only thing that, if anything, can get through a wireless system or cell system that's still up. Another lesson learned was backup generators, which are fantastic, and hopefully everyone has or is strategically planning to have one if you don't. But they're great, but they're not used to running for a long period of time. Oftentimes, if you have them, if you know whether or not you're part of the Joint Commish or other requirements of generators, usually you got to run them at either partial load or what have you, and annually at a not necessarily a full load, but a stronger load. And, there's supposed to be a 10-second kickover and what have you, and they're great. And they work initially. They come on, but they're not used to, again, running for extended periods of time. So one of the examples most recently, and I can tell you, is in Saipan, which I just got back from after Super Typhoon U2 hit. And their healthcare facility was on generators. They have fantastic generators over there. And FEMA was asking what is the maintenance plan they've been running for a couple of weeks now, but they're going to have to be maintained. What is that plan? And it's coming up with, do you have a plan? Do you have a plan that if you lose power and you're on constant generator power, how are you going to cycle your generator or conduct maintenance on it and keep it running and keep all the systems going that you need to keep going? And for them, that I guess the plan is FEMA was going to, and it's easier when you have one versus a lot of different facilities, is bringing in a temporary 500 kW and rotating the different generators. They had multiple generators, and taking one down and cycling it over to another generator and maintaining that and so forth. But things can break, and parts often are non-American made in a lot of these generators. And we found that out with these recent storms that have hit, and trying to get them in is a challenge. So, just having contingencies of, okay, what happens if my generator is running and I need to just ensure that I maintain it well so that it'll keep going and nothing will break, or if something breaks, what is my plan to either get another generator in, or do I have to now revert to a possible evacuation plan? Is if it's in the summertime, if we have heat-related and you can't get additional power in there and you're concerned that patient life safety or others will be at risk because of lack of, then those decisions have to be made. But that was a key lesson learned, is we're not used to these generators running that long. And also the other thing is fuel. And in an event, there's a lot of requests for fuel. And that's all great, but what do you do in the interim? Waiting, do you have a reserve? And if you don't have a reserve, that's a consideration. And what I recommend is at least to have 100 hours of extra fuel, if you can, stored, so that you can replenish your generators to an extent for that period of time while waiting for additional fuel to come in after you push that request in. And obviously, when you're storing fuel, there's considerations for NFPA and other regulatory requirements and such that you have to look into. But it is possible, and it is a smart thing to do. But you have to not only come up with a plan in accordance with regulations, but you also have to come up with a plan of how you're going to cycle that fuel through so it just doesn't sit there all the time. For example, as if you're running a generator and you need to top that off with your stored fuel. And as you replenish that way, you're not just using, just letting that sit for an extended period of time. The other thing that we learned, too, is medical gases. There's a lot of medical gas, for lack of better word, manufacturers, producers, and such that have that capability, but either it's not on the generator or it's on the grid. And so when power is lost, that's a key capability that is lost, and it oftentimes has to be brought in externally. And one of the challenges is anytime you try to bring in bottled oxygen or bottled medical gas, you have trouble, limitations, and you can't fly it in. If you can drive it in, if you can truck it in, that's fantastic. But if you're in a location in which that really isn't an option, you're very limited. I give you an example is when we had to fly recently to Saipan and bring we wanted to bring our oxygen tanks, but we couldn't get a waiver to clear them for flight, so we had to empty them all and have a contract on the other end. And fortunately, there was a location in which we could fill. But just as a consideration is okay, if you have a contract with a medical gas producer, what happens is if they are in a position where they can't produce you, what is your option? What are your other options? And you should go 2 or 3 deep. And also understand that everyone else may be tapping into that same marketplace, so to speak. And that has to do with supplies and such as well, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But when I mentioned evacuation is whether it's a generator, whether or not it's flooding, whether or not it's for some other reason, some of the challenges that we encountered were the lack of transportation, the lack of buses, ambulances, specialty vehicles, and whether or not it was because they were busy running 911 calls or busy running other ones or evacuating other facilities, or multiple facilities had contracts with the same company, which often occurs in a community where there are limited resources. And also being aware of the specialty vehicles that may be needed. And one of the things that we've encountered is that buses don't obviously work for everyone, and this may sound like common sense, but until you either experience it in real world or run exercises on it where you have people that have to be in a wheelchair for transport, and understanding that and knowing that because due to lack of muscle tone or what have you, they can't just sit in a bus. What are you going to do? You're going to need transportation for that. And an ambulance is a onesie, twosie thing, and that doesn't really work out. So how do you get a handy van or some type of vehicle that can handle multiple wheelchairs so you can start to move people out? Or how are you going to be able to handle that type of specialty patient in which you're going to need to transport with limited vehicles? Also, having a decision algorithm there was a lack of that. Most of you, I'm sure, have that. but having some type of guidance that in the event, let's say, your administrator is unable to get in, or if a decision has to be made on the spot. So it's either a house supervisor or the acting or the supervisor that's currently on site. They have to have some type of guidance in which this is when we need to make a determination of having to evacuate. And also, one of the challenges is the lack of a receiving facility. We saw this with a lot of the hurricanes that come in. Any type of event where you have time in which you're evacuating either pre-storm or pre-event, you're going to have this challenge, in addition to areas in which capacity is full to begin with. But the lessons learned that we had found is that pre-storm, a lot of these facilities up north or to the west of a lot of these facilities were being evacuated to those locations. And so they were filling up beds of the nearest facilities in these safe areas. So after the storm hit, when we were trying to find beds for patients, whether it was long-term care or whether or not it reached a point where a hospital had to be evacuated, that a lot of the closest facilities did not have any space because we had already filled them with a pre-storm evacuation. And so having a contingency plan for that is really important, and that's one thing that I hadn't thought about, didn't really consider, because we had considered moving folks to those locations. And this is just an example of our decision algorithm for evacuations, and I just thought it would be good to share that. And, criteria of when should you hasty versus planned evacuation, and when is it outside of the administrator making a split decision and saying, it's time to move, is, what are some factors or who has either the legal authority or should be consulted prior to evacuation, if anyone. And this is just what we use. And then obviously the decision to evacuate, to rather shelter in place. And we know that evacuation is a last resort. There's a lot of complications and such as a consequence of evacuation, so we don't like to do that. We prefer to shelter in place, but sometimes the building may not tolerate or conditions may warrant that. But having something like this, if you don't, is a good idea. And if you do, that's fantastic. And this is just an example of ours. And I mentioned a relocation capacity and just understanding that, who is your key person for coordination? Like our location in Hawaii, it would go through our healthcare coalition. So the facilities for placing patients, and we would do that so that we could coordinate and maximize the efficiency and effort of getting these patients to an appropriate location, not doubling up where you have one facility is receiving 5 different phone calls from these other facilities. And we're working on currently a bed board in order to give us visibility on that. But as I mentioned, impacted areas may have evacuated earlier, and that will reduce your bed space. So you may have to consider, okay, if we're in a position to push our patients out further, then what will that look like? Who do I need to contact? Because typically, if your transfer agreements are with facilities within a certain range, you may have to go further than that. All right. Some other lessons learned: transportation due to high water. I mentioned, I'll get back to, since we're mentioning high water, to generators, ensuring they're on some type of an elevated pad. It doesn't have to be on the roof per se, even though that's great if it is, depending on your type of facility. But at least if it's on a raised pad, to give it a chance if the area is prone to flood. because if the water reaches high enough, obviously, and the generator is in that path, then you're going to have a non-functional generator. And I mentioned sheltering in place, and some of the key lessons for that were that sometimes they were forced. Sometimes it wasn't a matter of, okay, I want to evacuate, but transportation can't get in, or I'm surrounded by water, or we're just going to have to hunker down and just make do with what we have until assistance can get here. Do you have everything that you need in order to be able to shelter in place? Do you have enough food? Staffing and I'll get into that further on, is important as well. But do you have all the components that you need to sustain your current patients as well as your staff in place? And environmentally, is it safe? And if it's not, how can you mitigate and to get them out as quickly as you can? Because a lot of times is the shelters, depending on where they at, there is a lack of medical shelters. And that's important. There's some medical shelters don't have generators. And I can speak, Hawaii is trying to work on that, but that makes it challenging and provides that extra burden on the healthcare facilities, because the public that has a lot of people on electric-dependent medical devices, that's one of the first questions they ask: which shelter can I go to that has a generator, so if power drops, is that I can plug in from an oxygen concentrator, or if they have a ventilator, or for something else. And right now, a lot of places either don't have capacity to be able to handle currently the functional access needs, or the ones that are medical devices that are that need electricity, or they don't have generators. So that's one thing I know that a lot of states are working. I mean, I'm working with our public health as well as with our state to try to ensure that we can strategically locate where we're going to have some medical shelters, and to make sure that we have generators of some sort so that we can provide that need and keep them going. Another thing is water. We know that electricity and water are big challenges when we don't have that within healthcare, because we need it not only for healthcare but for obviously basic needs, in addition to just caring for the patient. So having some external water failure, very common, and the lack of emergency water storage tanks are another challenge, because I'm sure all of you are looking at, okay, for preparedness, I need to have a gallon a day per person. And so either I have a facility which I have storage capacity to be able to store that much water, or I need to look at, okay, maybe my hot water heater, if I turn off the heat element, I have some potable water there, or at least some water I can bathe in. If I fill up some bathtubs, or if I fill up some buckets, some lines, some trash cans, fill it up with water before it runs out. Somehow, but how do you replenish that supply? How do you get water in? If you have a water tank, sometimes we can push water buffaloes and such to come and drop off water. But a lot of times there aren't enough water buffaloes to be able to just stay at a facility. So they have to, for lack of a better word, dump the water somewhere and come back. And if you don't have a retro hookup so that they can pump water into your building, or if you don't have a bladder, or if you don't have some type of a storage tank to be able to house that water so that you can use it, it makes it difficult. Otherwise, you have to use a tried and true. Use what you filled up with. If you have bottled water, if you have enough, and just factor in is how much additional water do I need for patient care. So I have a gallon a day for just drinking. How much do I need in order to carry out bathing for the patient? So if I don't have that, do I have wipes, the large body wipes, just in the event that we can't we don't have water. But then how do I do other types of patient care that I need water? Is how much do I need for that, and to plan for that accordingly. And the challenge with that is if you don't have the storage capacity or storage tank, and you're depending on bottled water, but from a vendor, it's always a challenge is can they get to you in a timely manner, and how many other people have contracts with them for bottled water, and when it comes down to a pinch, is they may be pulled in a lot of different directions. So what we advise our folks is that when you're doing any type of emergency contract with a vendor, ask them if they have any contracts with other healthcare facilities. And it's not a matter of getting names, but it's a matter of, okay, if you do, are you still able to meet the time requirements that I need as well as the volume requirements that we need? And if the answer is no, then, you need to try to find some alternative, because that commonly happens, and it's unfortunate, is whether it's medical supplies or whether it's in this situation we're talking about water, is there's only so many companies that go around, and a lot of people have these contracts with them. Waste management is another challenge. When water is gone, then you have the toilet flushing issues. So making sure it doesn't have to be potable water, but making sure you have some type of water so that you can pour into the tank so that you can flush the toilets. So having some type of a contingency plan of, okay, well, what water are you going to use, where are you going to get it for that, and what is your plan? And let's say, okay, there's a no flush order because the pipes have burst, and so you're not allowed to flush the toilet. So what do? Bag it? Do you put bags, just have them in the bowl and use bags and just double bag everything and then store it, and where are you going to store it? And what is your threshold of what happens when you reach capacity? What are you going to do with all the waste? Who are you going to reach out to? Who is that person going to be that you need to notify that you need this picked up or moved or what have you? And that's a challenge. So do you have a waste management system protocol, or contingency rather, for when your normal system goes down? And that's important. And that's a lot of times we don't think about it. Or when I was down in Irma, we were using seawater because the ocean was just kind of out the door, and we were just grabbing trash cans full of that and using that to flush the toilets. But again, that's only as good as you're able to, that the pipes hold and what have you. And if any of those burst and you're not allowed to do that, or you don't have that at your backyard, you have to have alternatives. So that's just food for thought. Another lesson learned is lack of paperwork to follow a patient. This happened in several situations. One happened where, in addition to the hurricane, there was a fire, and unfortunately, we know that California is suffering significant fires currently, and a lot of loss of life. But that fires and other events can cause fiber and other, I guess, servers and such to go down. And how do you, if I'm moving a patient to another location for a period of time, is having that transfer summary or having some type of a patient summary on that person that we're pushing over is very important to have. In addition to, I'll give you an example, is we had to emergency transfer some patients from a dialysis center to another dialysis center who were different companies. And unfortunately, the mainframe and fiber was out for that one facility. So we had to figure out okay, we move these patients over, is how we're going to do this. We don't have their prescription for the dialysis. We don't have their other information. It's almost like you're going to have to start over again with it. And so we have to plan for the timing of that and going through that whole part rather than just straight into dialysis. So having something, whether or not you can print out a quick summary sheet before everything goes down, or have something on file, an emergency sheet that can give some information on that patient is important for any type of a transfer, especially if there's an evacuation. Especially if staff aren't able to come and be with that patient. And that's one advantage with a full evacuation is a lot of times the staff is going with those patients to those facilities, and that's helpful if they have that information. But again, you have the staff that may have just come in, they're not that familiar with this patient, it's a new patient, and what have you. So, again, a backup plan for paperwork in the event your electronic medical record systems go down. Staffing was another challenge that I had mentioned earlier. Family accommodations to facilitate staff returning is very important. You know, having a policy or protocol that says, hey, if a disaster happens, obviously shelters are a better location, but in a pinch, as long as your staff know that their family or loved one is safe, they're in a place where they can get their basic needs met, they're able to work for you. But what we found is obviously family is always first. Staff don't show up for days sometimes because obviously they want to take care of their loved ones and such. But by providing an atmosphere or at least a plan to have family come to the facility and to have an area where the kids can play and where, you know, the family can stay and the staff members know that they're safe, you get more efficiency out of them, and the biggest thing is they'll show up. But the other thing is planning ahead, too. If it's an event that's coming, that you can pull in staff earlier. And what we found is sometimes there was a conflict because there wasn't a policy in place that some facilities tried to pull in staff, but the staff was like, wait a second, that's not generally part of, you know, what we do is this last minute pull-in. We're scheduled staff and what have you. And so some of them had to come up with a protocol or a policy afterwards that said, in the event of a disaster, this is what we're going to do, and inform the staff of that process. But if you get stuck, which we've had, is let's say you have one shift in and a disaster happens and you cannot get another shift in. So you're stuck with that shift for a period of time. Is you need to come up with a split shift. Maybe the ratio is going to change significantly. It may even double. But you can't continue to work your staff 24 hours until assistance comes because it just doesn't make sense and it's dangerous. So coming up with some type of a plan so that you can say, okay, this half you're going to rest right now, and this half you're going to work, and then we're going to, at this time, that shift is going to come in, and we're going to rest the other one until you can get additional assistance. The other items that are some lessons learned: dialysis patients, which is a big thing. Obviously, lack of food for specialized diets, lack of open acute or non-acute dialysis centers. You know, you need water, you need power, and you need waste management. You need all three of them to run dialysis, and without that, you're in a hard way. So what we've found is our dialysis centers are phenomenal, and most of them are across the United States with planned events and disaster-related items. But one thing that we did recognize is the fact that not all of our dialysis centers can have generators because they're in some strip malls and some other ones where the landlords are restricting it. And so it makes it challenging. So what do you do in an event in which you have some that are going to be down but others that are going to be up? So what we came up with is a plan to regionalize. And the sense is if I can't keep all of them up because I don't have generators that I can, from FEMA, that I can put at every single one, and it requires all these other elements, is we're going to pinpoint a few of them that are large, that have a large number of seats, that we're able to bring the dialysis patients within that area, whether they may go to some others, before or not, but now that location has lost power. But by doing that, we can more efficiently and effectively keep up some dialysis centers in order to meet that need, even though it's going to be a strong, almost like a 24-hour event to try to get people through, especially if it's been several days after that post-event and they haven't been dialyzed since. Chronic medication refills, always a challenge. Whether it was Saipan most recently or whether or not it's a hurricane or even a flood event, which we had on Kauai, where we had an isolated community, they could not get access to health care because they were completely cut off. The challenge is a lack of refrigeration. Challenge is pharmacies are closed or don't exist within those communities that are isolated, and the lack of adequate supplies. And we know what happens over time if the chronic medications run out. Then they start to develop acute symptoms, and things don't go well. So it's a matter of whether it's long-term care, whether it's home health hospice, or others, is to ensure that if there are certain times of the year in which disasters happen, like for us, hurricane season, it is just seeing if they can get a 2-week supply of medication at all times, just to ensure that if something were to occur, that they have enough to be able to carry them through, and to have it in a place to be able to quickly grab it if there has to be an evacuation in a go bag or whatever, to go to a shelter if they have to. Or if it's in a hospital, there's different, obviously, working with the pharmacy, the coalition, as well as the state to try to get additional medications in. What we do is we leverage for the hospitals and the long-term care and the other healthcare facilities within patients, facilities that are non-affected, to try to assist those that are affected, at least during the interim. And some security challenges, or you're going to have looting. You may go through an event and say, Chris, everything was fine. Everybody has been very cordial. They've stood in line. They're very patient, and what have you. And I've seen that, and I think that's fantastic. But I can tell you that I've been in austere conditions. When things get bad, unfortunately, survival instinct kicks in, and it's about caring for your family, and it's about caring for you. Whatever it takes, they're going to do. And sometimes those activities involve looting, whether they're robbing drugstores, breaking into them, trying to get medications, or from other homes, or from healthcare facilities, trying to get medications for the family members, whether it's fuel for their vehicles or for their generators at home. They're stealing or trying to siphon out of other facilities, or whether it's food and water, where they're showing up because they know that if you have an inpatient facility or what have you, that you have food, or trying to take it. It brings out the best in people, but it also can bring out the worst, depending on the situation. And social media, controlling staff and volunteers. This is a big thing that I really had to try to get ahead of, because with a lot of our disasters, major emergencies, and ones that have been deployed on social media, you have the good stuff where they're reporting, hey, I need help in this area, and they're giving great information, and other times they're putting out false information for whatever reason. We had some that were saying that water was going to be turned off in these certain counties, as well as waste management was going to be turned off pre-event, which was not correct. But that caused a panic in some of our healthcare facilities, because obviously that's going to impact care. As well as we received some false social media regarding evacuations of certain areas. And so I was getting phone calls asking, is this true? Is this accurate? So social media can be a great thing, but it can also be a challenge too. So ensuring that staff are aware also is of your photo policy and social media policy. Taking pictures and posting them, not good. Sometimes if you bring volunteers in and they're not familiar with, do you have a policy or not, and they start to take pictures and they post them, can and has resulted in a lot of issues. So it's important to have that type of policy in place to not only is how are you going to vet information when it comes in, or how are you going to counter social media if they're coming out with information that's not accurate, because you're going to have family members that are going to call that are going to overwhelm, want to know about their loved one, whether they're in an inpatient in a hospital, whether they're in an inpatient hospice facility, whether it's long-term care, what have you. They're going to be concerned about their loved one, and if they're also tracking social media, it could add fuel to the fire, so to speak. So ensuring that you have a public information officer or somebody that can at least counter some of that in an appropriate way, as well as have a policy so that staff understand that privacy, even during a disaster, even if you think that it's a picture that's heartwarming and so forth, it's important to ensure that they don't post that any pictures that they want to share that are pushed through the proper channels, and that should be the incident commander for the group from your public information officer if you're following ICS. And that's all I have. I know we started a little bit late, and I'm about 48 seconds over my time, but we'll open up for questions if you have some.
Thank you. We can now begin our question and answer session. If you have a question, please press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you wish to be removed from the question queue, press the pound sign of the hash key. If you're using a speakerphone, you may need to pick up the handset first before pressing the numbers. Once again, if you have a question, press star 1 on your phone. Our first question comes from Kim Hollowell. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, hi, Kim. What's your question?
Kim, is your line muted? Okay, let's move on to the next questioner, Carrie Beck.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's common for most healthcare facilities or long-term care to actually have the staff take the FEMA ICS classes, the online ones.
Yeah, it's really when we say common, we're trying to get more of a long-term care. A lot of ours in Hawaii have, but that's one thing that we're struggling with. But as being part of a coalition in accordance with a grant, you have to. And I always think it's a great idea too, because it's an organizational framework, and it's a gold standard. It's a best practice. So I am seeing a lot that are. The majority of administrators that I'm aware of have had ICS to a degree. It's a matter of getting the staff and the leadership all within kind of up to speed on all the ICS, depending on what level they're at. For example, you have some that are in the, for lack of a better, their command center, and that leadership should have to take additional ones like ICS 100, 200, and 700, and possibly even higher versus the line person, which might just have to take a preparedness video on family preparedness or something on their role during a disaster, what they would do. So, there's buckets, so to speak, depending on what their role is, and I'm seeing more and more take it, but I don't think we're at the level like for hospitals, and some that are regulatory or have regulatory requirements to take ICS. But it's a good idea, too.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, if you have a question, press star 1 on your telephone. And I have a question from Roger Huber.
Right. Yes, I was wondering, we're considering upgrading our generator system, and right now it's natural gas. And would you recommend staying with that as opposed to diesel, or?
great question. I would look at a couple things. For us, in the location that I'm at, propane is very difficult to come by. Diesel is easier. So in my situation, I would say probably diesel would be a better bet. However, propane has its advantages. I mean, if you have a vendor or a producer of propane near you, and getting refueled, so to speak, is not an issue. I would say stick with it. Propane is a great alternative.
But this is natural gas.
Natural gas. Okay.
Yeah,
Is it on a city line, or is it independent of, or do you have your own storage tank of natural gas?
No, it's from a gas company. No.
Okay.
It's piped in. So.
It's piped in.
Yeah.
So if something happened to that line, then obviously you would be in a hard way.
Okay.
And so I would look at is, there's a couple things you can, is it plausible to have a backup storage tank near your generator in case that line was cut, so to speak. Natural gas would be okay, but my only concern is what happens, again, is if that line gets cut. So,
okay.
Yeah, having some type of a backup or contingency if that were to occur, or to consider, they're costly. So, I'm hesitating to say that, to shift, but I think you can come up with a cost-effective solution as a contingency so that if that line were cut, that you can still bypass that and shift over to your, to some type of a backup tank. It doesn't have to be that big.
Diesel backup or something.
Yeah, that's a great alternative as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And once again, if you have a question, press star 1. And Doctor, it looks like we have no more questions.
Okay. Well, I hope that that had value and that people had learned from the presentation today, and I appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you, Doctor. And all speakers, please remember to stand by for your post-conference. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.